Good evening to all of you. Buonasera da Roma. I'm Avinoam Shalem. I'm the director of the American Academy in Rome, and I'm very happy to be here on this evening. And I would like to introduce my two dear colleagues who will run the evening here to you. The first is Dr. Sebastian Hill, who is the Drew Hines Librarian at the American Academy in Rome. He's namely the director of our library. And of course, the library is the core of the Academy in Rome, and his constant devotion to the library and for making it the prime source of the history of Rome, worldwide speaking, is admirable. You can see part of the library at the back of his screen now, and Sebastian, if you can just raise your hand so we know exactly who you are. And the other person that I would like to introduce is my dear colleague, Lynn Lancaster. Professor Lynn Lancaster is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at the Academy here. She is a great expert for the Roman history of Rome, and also especially to the water system of this city. In fact, like the water, she is the source of life of the Academy and of our Rome Prize Fellowship program. And by that, I give the baton actually to you, and they are very happy to be present in this wonderful evening with all the speakers that will be introduced to you by my colleague. So to you now, Sebastian.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you for participating, and of course to all the speakers, but especially thank you, Lynn, for organizing today's lecture dedicated to Chris Humer, the Academy's first Drew Hines librarian from 1992 through 2007. And of course, profound thanks to Brian Rose for his endowment and dedication of this lecture series to Chris. In her 15 years at the helm of the library at the Academy, Chris touched countless fellows, staff, and readers. I never had the privilege to meet Chris, but as the current Drew Hines librarian, it is very clear to me that she must have been an extraordinary person. Her recognition of her leadership and the affection towards her is fully visible to me through the comments and inquiries I regularly receive, and the dedication, such as tonight's event and our now paused but otherwise daily library tea, through which we honor Chris and her commitment to our library readers. And I'm also, in my background, is the reading room dedicated to Chris in the library. Chris Humer had a profound impact upon the Academy, the library, and everyone she collaborated with. Her achievements are numerous. They include the building of the Barbara Goldsmith Rare Book Room and a renovation and expansion of the library, which under her leadership has become the Arthur and Janet C. Ross Library that we know today. Chris co-founded the Urbs Network, which evolved into the present Urbis Library Network, and she hired, trained, and guided most of the library staff. In close association with Catherine Gefkin, Chris was the indefatigable historian of the Academy and an authority on the non-Catholic cemetery. Her research interests, her publications, and numerous collaborations throughout the city are too many to name here, but I can confirm that Chris's work, her personal relationships, her impact upon both the Academy and the people she met throughout her rich life continue to endure. To me, not having met her, this is her most impressive achievement and legacy, the love and respect she continues to generate and that I encounter in everyone who has met her and who speaks to me of her. Through her leadership of the library, her achievements and publications, and especially the admiration of her friends and colleagues, Chris Humer is present at the Academy every day. And I may say that over the years, as I walk through the stacks, as I read about the history of the Academy and her papers and publications, and as I speak to colleagues and friends who knew her, she has become a sort of a mentor. And I'm grateful to have tonight's opportunity to thank and commemorate Chris Humer for her leadership and her numerous accomplishments from which we all continue to benefit. Lynn?
Thank you, Sebastian. Well, I'm delighted to have our speakers, Judith Hallett and Stephen Royceville, to speak about Thornton Wilder and Lauro de Bosis tonight. We're also honored to have two guests, Tappan Wilder, nephew of Thornton, and Alessandro Cortese de Bosis, nephew of Lauro, each of whom will say a few words about their family members after the lecture. Now, many of you, especially the Americans, will know Thornton Wilder, one of the preeminent American writers of the 20th century. But some of you will know less about the poet Lauro de Bosis. So in this brief introduction to our lecture, I just want to set some context for the friendship between these two young idealists whose lives took very different paths. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So this was from the promotion, and we have Thornton Wilder on the left, who is aboard a ship, and Lauro de Bosis, who is by an airplane. So why is he by an airplane? Well, Thornton Wilder met Lauro de Bosis when he was studying at the American Academy in 1921. The de Bosis family was part of the Roman intelligentsia and often hosted gatherings at their home where the two young men met. Their friendship continued after Wilder's return to the US. And then after Wilder published Bridge of San Luis Rey in 1927, de Bosis translated the Italian edition for him. Wilder, in return, dedicated his epistolary novel, The Ides of March, about Julius Caesar, to de Bosis in 1948, 17 years after Lauro's death. The dedication is especially poignant because of the way young Lauro died. While giving lectures in America in the 1920s on behalf of the Italy-America Society, Lauro became disillusioned with fascism once the brutality of the regime became evident, and he established the Alleanza Nazionale as an underground organization to fight against the fascists in Italy. His American mother, Lillian Vernon de Bosis, was also involved, and she and some other friends in this group were arrested while he was out of the country. He was feeling helpless and determined to do something about this. So he went to France and took flying lessons with the intention of flying over Rome to drop anti-fascist leaflets. On October 3rd, 1931, he took off for Marseille with only 7.5 hours flying time under his belt and a partially filled fuel tank on his plane called Pegasus. After stopping on Corsica, he headed to Rome and flew over the city for half an hour, dropping the 400,000 anti-fascist pamphlets all over, including Piazza Venezia, where Mussolini was sitting in council. He then flew off before the Italian Air Force had time to muster. He flew out into the Tyrrhenian Sea and was never seen again. But he left behind a short story called The Story of My Death, describing his plans. And today he's seen as a martyr fighting against fascism. His portrait was added to the collection of Garibaldini on the Janiculum to the left, where you see me on a walk and talk, giving the story of Lauro de Bosis. And then on the right, you see Piazza Lauro de Bosis, which is the piazza surrounding the Mussolini's obelisk at Foro Italico, which after the war was actually named Lauro de Bosis. So it's sort of a nice irony when you go there to the piazza. I want to thank Judy Hallett for introducing me to the story of the friendship between Thornton Wilder and Lauro de Bosis when I first arrived as Mellon professor in 2018. This lecture has been long in the making. I'm delighted that it's finally come together tonight and that we have family members of both Wilder and de Bosis with us today. With that, I will introduce our speakers and then turn the podium over to them. And I will stop sharing here. Judith Peller Hallett is Professor of Classics and Distinguished Scholar Teacher Emerita at the University of Maryland, College Park. She earned her BA in Latin from Wellesley College and her AM and PhD in Classical Philology from Harvard University. Thanks to the Classical Association of New England's Cornelia Catlin Coulter Scholarship, she attended the American Academy Classical Summer School in 1969. And she's returned to Italy on countless occasions since. She's published widely on Latin language and literature, women, the family and sexuality in Greco-Roman antiquity, and the study and reception of classics in the Anglophone world, focusing on Edith Hamilton, Thornton Wilder, German Jewish refugee scholars, and American women classicists, several such as Elizabeth Hazelton Haight and Lily Ross Taylor, with major connections with the American Academy. A former Blagan visiting scholar in the Vassar College Classics Department and Susan Deal Booth resident scholar at the Center for Intercollegiate Studies in Rome, Hallett has held fellowships from the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities and received major grants from the National Italian American Foundation and the NEH. In 2013, a collection of essays from Routledge, Domina Illustris, Latin Literature, Gender and Reception, celebrates her academic career. And our other speaker is Stephen Royceville, who earned an MD, that is a medical degree, from Georgetown University in 1969. And following his psychiatric residency there, he practiced psychiatry for 40 years, being named a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. During this time, he published articles on the intersection of psychiatry and the humanities, and on the use of poetry in psychotherapy. When he had decreased his practice to half-time, he began fulfilling his lifelong interest in languages and literature by learning Greek, and then proceeding to the study of Latin. Judith Hallett, his first Latin teacher since high school, encouraged him to pursue formal studies, culminating in an MA in classics at University of Maryland. And then after retiring from practice, he went on to earn a PhD in comparative literature with a dissertation on Thornton Wilder and the classics under the supervision of Professor Hallett. Recent publications have focused on classical reception, including James Joyce and William Shakespeare, and on the Polish text of novels by Olga Tokarczuk. He's currently working under contract for publication on Thornton Wilder and the classics. And I will now turn it over to Steve, who will start, and then later he will pass the baton back to Judy.
Molto grazie. We are very happy and honored to be here at the Academy in Rome. Siamo molto felici ed onorati di essere qui all'Accademia Americana di Roma. We wish to express our deep thanks to the Academy, to Brian Rose for making the humor lecture possible, to Corey Brennan for connecting us with the AA archives at the Smithsonian, and to the staff at the Academy's archives at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Desideriamo esprimere il nostro profondo ringraziamento all'Accademia, a Brian Rose per aver reso possibile questa conferenza humor, a Corey Brennan per averci collegato con l'archivio dell'Accademia presso la Smithsonian Institution, ed agli archivisti dell'Accademia presso la Smithsonian Institution di Washington. Aldo Setaioli was particularly helpful in guiding our research and overseeing its publication in the Giornale Italiano di Filologia. Aldo Setaioli è stato particolarmente utile nel guidare la nostra ricerca e supervisionare la sua pubblicazione nella rivista Giornale Italiano di Filologia. It's a great honor to share this platform with Alessandro Cortese de Bosis, nephew of Lauro, and with Thornton Wilder, nephew of Thornton. È un grande onore condividere questo podio con Alessandro Cortese de Bosis, nipote di Lauro, e con Thornton Wilder, nipote di Thornton. Thank you all very much. Grazie mille a tutti. The American author, Thornton Wilder, who was born in 1897 and died in 1975, received numerous awards for his groundbreaking novels and plays. Among them, 3 Pulitzer Prizes in 2 different fields. The first was in the area of fiction for The Bridge of San Luis Rey in 1928. The second and third in the category of drama for Our Town in 1938 and The Skin of Our Teeth in 1942. Along with Wilder's novels, such as The Woman of Andras in 1930, The Ides of March in 1948, and Theophilus North in 1973, and plays such as The Matchmaker in 1954 and The Alcestiad in 1955, all 3 works owe a large debt to his studies in Italy. After graduating from Yale University in 1920, Wilder became a visiting student at the American Academy in Rome. Both his studies at the Academy and the lasting relationships forged at that time inspired his evocations of Latin and especially Greek literature, as well as the archaeological motifs that pervade his writings. In particular, Wilder's friendship with the young Italian poet Lauro de Bosis and the de Bosis family proved formative for much of his intellectual and creative life. These Roman experiences helped shape Wilder into a modern-day poeta doctus, Latin for a learned writer, who consciously placed his work within an earlier, in his case, the classical tradition. After arriving in Rome in October 1920, Wilder spent the next 8 months studying Latin, Italian, and archaeology at the AAR. 2 professors in particular appear to have had a profound effect on Wilder's development. Ralph von Deman Magoffin, then professor of classics at Johns Hopkins, and Walton Brooks McDaniel, professor of classics at the University of Pennsylvania. Wilder enrolled in a variety of courses, including epigraphy, Roman private life, Roman history, numismatics, classes that he described as being at the PhD level, and he visited major archaeological sites, but without earning academic credit. Field trips to ancient ruins under the direction of Magoffin especially fueled Wilder's imagination. On October 21st, 1920, shortly after he started his studies, Wilder participated in an archaeological excavation in Rome, examining the tomb of the Aurelius family, now located under a street near the center of the city. Fascinated by both the descriptive depictions of faded paintings of the Aurelius children playing in the garden and artifacts found in the burial area, Wilder wrote that 2,000 years from now, other people will excavate the loves and pieties and habits of current humanity, just as he himself did in many of his works. Wilder memorably describes the impact of excavating an Etruscan town. One day, our class in Rome was taken out in the country to dig up a bit of the Etruscan world, the street. Once thousands of people had walked it. The rut was very deep. Those who uncovered such a spot are never the same again. He emphasized the importance of geologic and historic stratification, as well as the presence of artifacts for understanding specific locations and societies, both in his plays, Pullman-Car Hiawatha, 1931, in Our Town, and his novels, The Eighth Day in 1967, and Theophilus North. Among the most famous lines in Our Town are the stage manager's declaration in the middle of Act 1 concerning the preservation of artifacts. They're put in a sort of a burial chamber box. So people 1,000 years from now would know this is the way we were in our growing up and in our marrying and in our living and in our dying. Wilder's fascination with the geological and historical stratification culminates in a comparison between the layers of ancient Troy and the cities of Newport, Rhode Island and Theophilus North. Wilder's most recent biographer, Penelope Niven, summarizes Thornton's time at the American Academy. His Roman days were full of lectures and sightseeing, the occasional raucous party of graduate students, and the more sedate entertainments in the homes of new acquaintances, expatriates, the Academy Circle, and native citizens. Although prized in the Academy milieu for his exquisite interpersonal skills and his willingness to help others, Thornton ventured beyond it. In a handwritten letter to his mother on April 4th, 1921, Thornton describes his first meeting with the de Bosis family. Mrs. Jackson begged me to come and read, this was his play, Villa Rabani, to a friend of hers, Signora de Bosis, wife of a prominent Italian man of letters, Italy's standard translator of Shelley, for example. They're a large family, living in an old house an hour from Rome, on plain living and high thinking. I met one of the sons, Lauro, elegante, delicately mustachioed, only 19, but conversant, even passionné, over higher philosophies, anxious to know if I accepted so-and-so's pluralism or clung to neo-Hegelian realism, urging me to read Plato with a small group of his in the Greek. Later, attending the salon organized by Lauro's father, Adolfo de Bosis, Wilder met Italian and foreign intellectuals, and on one occasion, the American poet Ezra Pound. A mutually admiring relationship emerged between the 23-year-old Wilder and the 19-year-old Lauro, whom Wilder considered for many years thereafter as one of the best friends I have in the world. That's a direct quote. As Lynn said, upon translating Sophocles' Oedipus Rex in Italian, Lauro presented Wilder with an inscribed copy, which he kept in his private study the rest of his life. And this is what Lynn said, but when Lauro translated Wilder's The Bridge of San Luis Rey into Italian, Wilder also kept that and valued it highly. The two men corresponded in French, sharing both personal and literary observations, along with major political concerns. Lauro also wrote plays in Italian verse, chief among them Icaro, published in 1930, which retells the Daedalus Icarus legend as an allegory against fascist tyranny, representing the Greek artist Daedalus as caving in to the demands of the Cretan dictator Minos. It depicts his son Icarus as actively resisting the dictator, but eventually meeting his death by falling from the sky into the sea while flying. De Bosis, however, portrays Icarus's death not as a defeat, but as a triumph, a heroic example for others in the fight against tyranny. Lauro de Bosis would himself die by falling from the sky into the sea, another heroic example for others. In the story of my death, alluding to the Greek mythic winged horse Pegasus, the name he chose for the aircraft, on his final flight, Lauro wrote, "We are not going to chase chimeras, but to carry a message of liberty to an enslaved people beyond the sea." Lauro de Bosis not only influenced Thornton's novels and plays in their evocations of Greek and Latin literature, but also in their portrayals of tyranny and freedom. In the Ides of March, for example, Julius Caesar's reflection on power and absolutism derived from de Bosis's writings and actions against Mussolini. In the Ides, moreover, the young Roman poet Catullus resembles the young Roman poet Lauro de Bosis multiple ways. Among them is love of Greek literature in the original, frequent dips in the Tiber, and unswerving resistance to tyranny. The fictional Catullus circulates fiery anti-Caesarian invectives for replication by the recipients and forwarding to others, pro-freedom pamphlets directly modeled on Lauro's anti-fascist newsletters. While Wilder thus helped fulfill de Bosis's challenge to carry a message of liberty to an enslaved people literally through his representation of Catullus in the Ides of March, he also fulfilled the summons politically. In the 1957 Frankfurt Address delivered in German, Kultur in einer Demokratie, Culture in a Democracy. Here, Wilder defines the task of contemporary democracy as creating new myths and metaphors to describe the new dignity and freedom of humanity. On a literary level, too, interactions with de Bosis led Wilder to engage with the same ancient Greek writers embraced by the young Italian: Homer, the Athenian tragedians, especially Sophocles, and Plato. In the Kabbalah, Wilder's first novel, published in 1926, the narrator comforts a dying poet resembling John Keats by speaking of two ancient Greek writers, Sappho and Euripides. In the Ides of March, Julius Caesar similarly comforts the dying Catullus with verses from Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus. Catullus's lover, Clodia, herself finds inspiration in the lyrics of the Greek poet Sappho. References to Homer abound in the Kabbalah, the Eighth Day, and the Theophilus North. Recitations of Plato are central to the plot of The Woman of Andras. Amid Wilder's evocations of Greek writers, Latin writers also loom large. Most obviously, The Woman of Andras, a tragic novel written in the year before de Bosis's death, takes place on a Greek island and accords a prominent place to Greek literary works. Yet, Wilder based it on a Latin comedy by Terence. In the Ides of March, dedicated to de Bosis himself, Wilder not only quotes specific passages from Catullus in Latin, but also renders into English the first 5 lines of Catullus' poem 51, a translation of Sappho's poem 31 in her own distinctive meter. Wilder's experiences at the American Academy of Rome also sparked the structure, plot, and motifs of his first novel, The Kabbalah. First-person narrator, a classically educated young American with a Puritan background on his first trip to Europe, resembles Wilder himself. The novel treats a vast range of Italian cultural and historic topics, including the literature and religion of ancient Rome, legends of medieval Italy, the writings of Dante, the experiences of European visitors in the 19th century, and the rarefied social milieu embracing Italian aristocrats and expatriate Americans. The author's dedication of the book reads, "To my friends at the American Academy in Rome, 1920-1921, TW." 22 years later, Wilder would dedicate the Ides of March to Lauro de Bosis. These dedications indicate the significance of Wilder's time in Italy and his ties with de Bosis to the development of his writings. I'm going to pass this to Judy now.
Thanks for the baton. Both of Wilder's professors and residents at the American Academy in Rome during the 1920 through 1921 academic year, Walton Brooks McDaniel of Penn and Ralph Van Deman Magoffin, then of Hopkins, were dynamic, powerful presences in the discipline and profession of classical studies. Each left his mark on Wilder's literary vision, which encompassed multiple aspects of classical antiquity. Some of Wilder's fellow AAR students would, over the next several decades, also advance the study and teaching of classics in a variety of ways, and we would maintain influence Wilder's writings. As graduate student librarian at the Smythe Classical Library in Harvard's Widener Library from 1967 through 1969, I actually met Walton Brooks McDaniel. The oldest living Harvard alumnus at the time of his death at age 107 in 1978, McDaniel survived his student Wilder, 26 years his junior, by 3 years. After receiving his Harvard AB in 1893, this is 4 years before Wilder was born, and his Harvard Classical Philology PhD in 1899, McDaniel then taught at Harvard for 2 years, enrolling one Franklin Delano Roosevelt class of 1904 in his Latin classes. In 1943, when celebrating his 50th Harvard College reunion, McDaniel confessed that he had given FDR, at that point the US president, a grade of D-. But that same year, McDaniel also presented Smythe Library with his personal collection of Roman antiquities. I would encounter him on his visits to these artifacts, which illustrate Roman private life, shades of our town, and the survival of ancient religious belief in modern Italy, shades of the Kabbalah. These were two of his major research interests. Beginning in late December 1920, with several months of AAR residency still to follow, McDaniel assumed the presidency of the American Philological Association, aka the APA, the North American Professional Organization for Classicists. He held office through late December 1921, delivering his presidential address in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on new life out of Italy and Greece, and diversifying the APA membership roles by recruiting such notables as then Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, financier and later newspaper publisher and Federal Reserve Chair Eugene Meyer of New York, Bryn Mawr College President M. Carey Thomas, and Columbia University graduate student Ernestine Franklin, who arrived at the AAR in the fall of 1921 as its first Jewish female fellow and would later marry Harry Leon, Wilder's fellow AAR student. We'll hear more about them shortly. In a 1973 letter to the 76-year-old Wilder, the 102-year-old McDaniel reminisces about the start of their friendship that we greatly prize, I'm quoting, at the AAR, noting that his late wife foresaw Wilder's brilliant career. McDaniel continues, before you composed the Ides of March, I recall commending to you the 1st century BC as a marvelous period in which to date a work of fiction. When we are next together, I may have the courage to make a suggestion for your future writing. McDaniel adds a postscript about the poet Ezra Pound, whom, as we've just heard, Wilder met in Rome at the home of the de Bosis family, saying, I had Ezra as a student during 2 years as an undergraduate at Penn and then 1 in the graduate school. He was a very young lad when he came to college. Perhaps a year before Ezra died, I wrote him a cordial letter, but I never got any reply. Kindly convey my centenarian blessings, can't even that word, to his daughter. Ralph Van Deman Magoffin's roots in Rome and at the American Academy ran deep. His aunt, Esther Van Deman, after earning her AB and AM in Latin from Michigan in 1891 and her PhD in Latin from the University of Chicago in 1898, first came to Rome in 1901 to spend 2 years excavating the House of the Vestal Virgins in the Forum. From 1906 through 1909, Van Deman worked at the School of Classical Studies while completing her 1909 monograph on the Atrium Vestae. As an academy fixture over the next 4 decades, she arduously labored to establish a chronology of construction on ancient Roman sites through an analysis of building materials. Her nephew Ralph, a fellow Michigan alumnus, joined her in Rome in 1907 as an AAR fellow studying the topography of ancient Praeneste. In 1921, at the end of his AAR year with Wilder, Magoffin assumed the presidency of the Archaeological Institute of America, with which the APA held its annual meetings each December, and he had a 10-year term. McDaniel's APA presidency lasted only 1 year. In 1923, Magoffin also left his professorship at Hopkins to head the classics department at New York University, remaining there till 1930. Magoffin's 8 published books included a series of secondary school Latin textbooks and Magic Spades, the Romance of Archaeology, once widely used as a university textbook. On March 29th, 1921, this is 100 years and 1 day ago, perhaps in homage to his formidable Aunt Esther, Magoffin delivered a lecture at the Academy on the influence of women in classical antiquity, arguably sparking Wilder's later focus on such influential Greek and Roman historical female figures as Clodia, Cytheris, Cleopatra, and Sappho in the Ides of March, and the fictitious Chrysis in the Woman of Andras. 2 formidable female students at the AAR with Wilder, Ethel Lee Chubb and Elizabeth Hazelton Haight, warrant particular attention. In 1920, Chubb, who had received BA and MA degrees from the University of Toronto in 1906 and 1907, and subsequently done 2 years of graduate work at Bryn Mawr, had just completed her PhD at Penn under McDaniel's colleague, John Rolfe. After her AAR year, Chubb returned to her earlier post as Latin teacher at the Philadelphia High School for Girls. There, her students included my own secondary Latin teacher, Ruth Rosenberg Ehrlich, who did her undergraduate work first at Bryn Mawr and then at Penn, graduating in 1929. Magoffin's report as professor in charge, which does not mention Wilder, refers to Chubb twice. First, as recipient of reports students were expected to file about self-conducted trips of no fewer than 4 persons to classical field sites, and second, as having classified and cataloged the collection of Roman lamps in the AAR Museum in a catalog ready for publication. But in 1923, Chubb herself published an article about the American School of Classical Studies in Rome in the Classical Weekly, describing her own experiences and promoting its newly established summer school. While not mentioning Wilder or any of her fellow residents, she furnishes much more detail than does Magoffin about the field trips and courses in richly textured prose, vividly conveying the physical essence of being there. For example, she relates that on these countryside excursions, some incident or custom of people recalled and shed light upon some passage of an ancient author. The primitive plow drawn by long-horned white oxen, the man in bare feet tramping out the grapes in a vat, the vines trained on elm trees. The ancient pagan past in Italy is found not only in lifeless stones, it still lives in the customs and beliefs of the present. That's a vintage Walton Brooks McDaniel sentiment. Magoffin reports that Professor Elizabeth H. Haight of Vassar conducted the school to Horace's Sabine farm and gave us there a talk on the Roman poet Horace. A letter from Thornton to his mother on March 21st, 1921, that's 100 years and a week ago, offers his sarcastic perspective on that field trip, inquiring, "Did I tell you about our trip to Horace's farm and tea under the temple of Sibyl and the falls that cured my sinuses insomnia and never failed to stimulate Horace's stylus?" At intervals of tired trouble on the drive, Miss Elizabeth Haight, head of the Latin department, would rise from her seat and give us sympathetic little talks on the Horatian associations. Only her efforts to be literary and charming were so ambitious that she floundered in. No one else noticed this. Wilder's derision aside, the word ambitious pithily sums up Haight's successful professional career. Born in 1872, Haight had received her A.B. in 1894 and her A.M. in 1899 from Vassar, whose faculty she joined in 1902 while working on her Cornell Ph.D. And soon after her return to Vassar from the AAR in 1921, she was promoted from associate to full professor of classics. In 1927, Haight would become the first woman to chair the advisory council of the then American School of Classical Studies in Rome. And from 1933 to 1934, she became the second woman president of the APA. In 1935, during her sabbatical in Rome, Vassar's president arranged for Haight to have an audience with Benito Mussolini and present several volumes from Vassar honoring the bimillenaries of Horace and the Emperor Augustus. Characterized by Donald Latyner as an engaged feminist teacher whose course on ancient myth emphasized the significance of women joining every hero to one or more heroines, Haight published pioneering research on the ancient novel, spotlighting its women characters. Her female-focused lens on the ancient world has strong affinities with Wilder's. Wilder was acquainted with the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, Haight's Vassar Latin student and longtime correspondent, for whom Haight is said to have harbored an unrequited passion. A letter from Wilder to the actress Ruth Gordon in 1933 describes his pushing Millay in a rickshaw for a mile at the Chicago World's Fair, but it is unclear if Wilder ever associated Millay with her Vassar teacher Haight. Magoffin's report frequently mentions Harry Leon, who spent from 1920 through 1922 at the AAR, writing his Harvard PhD dissertation on the Jews of ancient Rome as a Sheldon Fellow. Magoffin's report notes that Leon headed a travel party to Sicily, presented his own translation of the Birds of Aristophanes in the theater of Dionysius in Athens during an AAR trip to Greece, for which he worked out the trip schedules and accounts, and that he served as an invaluable assistant in routing and conducting trips and excursion to classical sites. And he last mentions that Leon did considerable work on certain features of Cicero's style. A 1918 Harvard graduate, a year Wilder senior, Leon met Ernestine Franklin in 1921 when she came to the AAR for her two successive fellowship years. He joined the University of Texas faculty in 1923, married Ernestine in 1924, and the two taught at Texas until their deaths a few weeks apart in December 1967 and January 1968. No correspondence between Wilder and Leon's has yet surfaced. We're still looking, but Wilder's decision to create an Italian Jewish family as characters in Theophilus North may render subtle homage to Harry and Ernestine Leon and to Leon's studies of ancient Roman Jews. And so may Emily Webb's lines in Act 2 of the 1938 Our Town. Here goes. Oh, Ernestine, can you come over tonight and do Latin? Isn't that Cicero the worst thing? Tell your mother you have to. Back to you, Steve.
Well, in conclusion, Thornton Wilder's time in Rome imprinted Italian culture, archaeological modes of thinking, and Italian, Latin, and ancient Greek literature on his creative imagination. His studies at the Academy, friendships made through the Academy, especially the ties with Lauro de Bosis and the de Bosis family, had an indelible impact on Wilder's work. Not only did they deeply influence his intricate, multi-layered writings, which abundantly allude to Greek, Roman, and Italian literary works, they also shaped his distinctive perspective on humanity, a 20th century American sensibility enriched by his Italian experiences. American and world literature owe a great deal to the American Academy in Rome, Thornton Wilder, and his interactions with the de Bosis family. Thank you.
Thank you both, Steve and Judy. So now we are going to turn to Tappan Wilder. And Tappan is Thornton Wilder's nephew and has served for 26 years as his literary executor. He's a graduate of Yale, holds an MA in American History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and an MPhil in American Studies from Yale. In 1962, he was the recipient of a Rockefeller Brothers Fellowship in Theological Education. And after that, he held administrative positions at Yale for 15 years, principally in urban studies and related interdisciplinary programs before moving to Washington, D.C. in 1979. And during the past decades, he's been intensely engaged in overseeing edited volumes of his uncle's works, as well as publications of previously unpublished works. He's also collaborated on productions of Wilder's plays and biographical works on his uncle's life. And I know from my collaboration with Judy that he's been tremendously supportive of investigations of Wilder's interest in the classics. So Tappan?
Thank you all. I speak to you from California. It's morning here and I have my cup of coffee. And I'm so grateful to the American Academy for this event, and what an honor to share a bit of a platform with the nephew of Lauro de Bosis. We're closing in on the 125th anniversary of Thornton Wilder's birth, and it's a time to take stock, and we're doing that. And I'm very proud, my family and I speak for my sister who's in Maine, and my daughter, and my first-year-old granddaughter, whose name is Niven, named for Thornton Niven Wilder and Amos Niven Wilder. My dad was Thornton's older brother. We're proud that everything is in print, and the books that you've heard mentioned, that's my job as a literary executor to point out that you can read. They're in audio, and they're also, of course, in digital form and print form in our country, and also in many countries throughout the world. We're very proud of that, and I'm very proud also and salute the scholars who are interested in Thornton Wilder. It's significant that the current president of the Thornton Wilder Society is not a professor of English, as you might expect, but is a professor of classics, Merry English. And you've seen on parade today two marvelous scholars who are devoted Wilder fans. And whenever any of these fellas and women get close to the archives, I purr like a cat, because there is much to learn about Thornton Wilder. Everything may be in print, but we have so much more to learn, and they're leading the way, and it's exciting to be part of this lecture. And now I'm going to be quiet and share the stage with you pros. Thank you for having me, Lynn. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, Tappan. Before I introduce Senor Cortese de Bosis, I would just say, if anyone has questions, we're not going to have a lot of time for question and answer, but if anyone has questions, please write it in the Q&A, and that is recorded, and we will send it out to the participants so that they can be in touch with you later. So it's really my honor to be able to introduce Alessandro Cortese de Bosis. He was a young boy when his uncle was lost at sea, but he remembers well the concern when the stories began to circulate about what had happened. In his adult life, he went on to have a distinguished diplomatic career. After the war, he served in Paris, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. Later, he was appointed consul general at the Italian consulate in New York City. He's also served as Italian ambassador to Hungary and to Denmark, and as Director General of Cultural Affairs at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After retiring from his diplomatic career, he became president of the American University of Rome, our neighbor here on the Janiculum, and later advisor of the president of St. John's University for the Italian campus. As president of the National Association of the Veterans of the War of Liberation, he works to keep alive the memory of events connected with World War II in Italy. And in 1994, he published a book, the English edition of which is called In No Man's Land, Italian Officials with Allied Regiments, in which he recounts the stories of the Italian soldiers working alongside the Allies to liberate Italy. Please, Signor Cortesi de Bosis, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm very proud to take the floor for a moment. I also want to thank what has been said. Thank you all for what has been said about Thornton Wilder. I remember my grandmother speaking a lot about the great friendship between Lauro and Thornton. And also when I went to the States, Ruth Draper, the great loving companion of Lauro, spoke to me a lot about Thornton. For a moment, I would like also to remember the testament that Lauro wrote before his flight from Marseille to Rome, before taking off, the story of my death. And I want to remind you about this title because I found later on an article in the New York Herald Tribune written 12 years later during the Italian campaign before Rome was liberated. And the striking title was The Story of a Death. And the story of a death is about Lauro. And I will read just a few lines. Last Sunday, which saw the Allied armies of liberation conveying towards Rome, was the 12th anniversary of a half-forgotten but no less gallant invasion of the citadel of fascist tyranny by a young man by the name of Lauro de Bosis. When he conceived the idea of bombing Rome with leaflets, he had never piloted an airplane. He succeeded in learning to fly and acquired a plane. And I must also add at this point that the money to acquire the plane was loaned to him by the director of a newspaper in Brussels called Le Soir, which then underlines the European aspect of the attempt that Lauro made to remember people about the tyranny, to remind everyone in Italy that they should fight against it as their ancestors in the wars of independence. The exploit was a sensation at the time. Unfortunately, it was the sensation that was remembered and not the significance behind it. Today, the interest lies less in the heroism of the act than in the accuracy of the prophetic message which it was intended to drive home. De Bosis' leaflets might have been written this spring, 12 years later. De Bosis offered his own life in order to prevent the catastrophes which had been since taken place. The end is still as Lauro de Bosis saw it to be. Quote, the new oppressors are fiercer and more corrupt than the old, but they will also fall. Let me just add my great satisfaction at this conference being another evidence of the cultural interdependence between Italy and the United States. We are very grateful not only to the Academy, but of course to Harvard University for having created a fellowship entitled to Lauro de Bosis, thanks to important donation by Ruth Draper in 1934, and the spirit of independence of the president of Harvard of that time, Professor Conant, notwithstanding all the pressure by fascist sympathizers in America who wanted to prevent the creation of a fellowship of that kind, especially because it was entrusted to Professor Salvemini, an exile from Italy, professor of history, who kept that fellowship until 1956. And notable, important men of culture, shall we say, from Italy, including Romano Prodi, also Sergio Romano, and others, and Silo Slabini especially, came to Harvard and were fellow guests to speak about Italian culture for 5 or 6 months at a time. I hope that Harvard will cooperate, as I was saying at the beginning of this conference, in remembering Lauro's flight on October the 3rd. We are spreading the news on every school in Italy. As a president of the Association of the Italian Veterans of the War of Liberation, as we call it, we are insisting with all the schools to remember not only Lauro, but also the others, Amendola, Gobetti, and other fighters, anti-fascist fighters, who were either killed or put in jail. The special courts, the fascist courts created by Mussolini, sentenced people to jail, 5,000 years in jail in 4 years were the sentences created by these tribunals, or shall we say, criminal courts created by Mussolini. All this, and of course the works of other anti-fascist leaders like Amendola are being underlined and spread in the schools. And I confirm how grateful I am to the American Academy for having reminded Lauro's gesture and the great books written by Thornton Wilder, and dedicated one of them, The Ides of March, to Lauro de Bosis. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. We don't have, well, we don't have any time left, but I'm going to make a little bit more time. And I have taken a quick look at the questions, and there were a number of people who said that I want to learn more about Lauro de Bosis. There is one book in English, which I have, well, you can't see it because of my background. It's called The Poet and the Dictator, Lauro de Bosis Resists Fascism in Italy and America. And it's written by Jean McClure Mudge, M-U-D-G-E. And for anyone who would like to learn more about Lauro, I'd highly recommend it. It's a very readable, enjoyable book. And then I gather there will be another book in Italian that will be coming out this summer as well. And so I think people are coming to learn, more and more about the legacy of Lauro de Bosis. But before we got on, Judy actually asked me if she could please ask Senor Cortese de Bosis a question while she has him here. And so I think we will end with Judy's question.
How did your family remember Thornton Wilder? There's some wonderful correspondence of your grandmother with Thornton from the 1940s, and I'd love to hear how he was spoken of in your family when you were growing up.
Well, of course, my grandmother, Lillian Vernon de Bosis, concentrated herself on American and Italian culture, and she was a fanatic of Thornton Wilder. I think Thornton Wilder also came to our own house on the Adriatic Sea, where we went in the summer with Lauro himself, an old tower that was bought by my grandfather, Adolfo de Bosis, and where he had one of the headquarters, shall we say, of his society, the convito, the cultural banquet, as it was called, with Carducci, who then later on got the Nobel Prize for Literature, and of course, D'Annunzio and other poets. And so certainly Wilder was thoroughly imbued with this culture together with Lauro, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
think we are about out of time, but I just want to thank all of you so much for joining us. I think this exceeds anything that Judy and I could have imagined in 2018 when we began this. And you know, it's really been through some hurdles, including COVID, where it was canceled last year. But I'm so glad that it was, because we ended up getting connected with the Cortese de Bosis family. And this has just been a really exciting event for all of us. So thank you all so much. If anyone, would you like to say something?
Just want to thank all the participants in this amazing story of friendship between Italy and the United States, and but in a personal and a nice way. I think that it was a good example of how important is oral history today. And I think that this is something that all of us are very thankful to the voices that gave us some information about the past here. I also read some of the questions that were put on the box, which are very interesting to read, and I thank also the audience for enthusiasm and engagement in this presentation. Thank you all, and have a good night. I'm saying good night from here, Rome, to all. A good day as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you all again. Goodbye.
Could I say a word?